Thank you very much. I'm very, very honored to be here today. It is exciting to come back to Leipzig, where I once studied, and now having the honor to speak here. And I'm here today to speak about nuclear energy and regulatory capture in Japan. Because this room is full of people working on Japan, social scientists working on Japan, I assume that the case of Fukushima is sufficiently known that I do not have to explain details. What I would like to explain to you is some legal aspects. Okay, can we turn up the volume? So I don't have to stand up this all the time. So what I will offer today is a lawyer's perspective into the case, and I hope that I can convey to you why analyzing the Fukushima case through the lens of law is very exciting and it's very telling and informative. But at the same time, I will try to create a bridge to my previous speakers who have spoken on the history and also on the political science aspects of nuclear energy and energy in Japan. So I hope we can enter into some interesting discussion and controversial discussion, hopefully. Now, what I will do today is I will, firstly I will provide you with a very brief and simple introduction of nuclear liability law in Japan. This is what I will focus on. And then I will take you back 50 years in time, half a century, from the Fukushima accident to the year of 1961, when the Japanese nuclear liability law was enacted. I will then go forward to the year of 2011 and try to show you how this legal history determines the fate of the victims today. The Fukushima accident is the largest liability case in human history, with over 2 million claimants and a scope of damages, third-party liability damages between 80 billion and perhaps 200 billion euros that is yet open. And I will show you how the legal history determines the fate of victims today. Finally, I will try to analyze the law and think about with you the concept of regulatory capture and whether this theory can explain what we have ended up with in Japan today. Okay, so just as a very, very stupid, simple introduction overview on nuclear law, because obviously we're talking about energy in Japan, and I'm focusing on nuclear energy, and in nuclear energy I'm focusing on regulation. And I will further narrow down my scope. The two important aspects of legislating on nuclear energy in terms of accidents is both prevention and mitigation. So laws on prevention could be to stipulate safety rules, of course, to enact licensing system, to create supervisory bodies for nuclear power plants, and to create liability rules that hold operators or producers liable for accidents. The second purpose of nuclear law is, in the terms of accidents, is to mitigate accidents. So, for instance, you can declare a state of emergency, you can issue evacuation orders, or you can control food safety. You know all this from Japan because Fukushima is a perfect example of all these legislatory measures employed. You can also think about insurance systems, and you can support and compensate the victims. You can think about waste management and decontamination and so forth. I will further narrow down because things are very complicated, and nuclear law is a very, very large body of law. Even before Fukushima, Japan had over 30 laws on nuclear energy, and over 50 procedures have to be followed to get a reactor running. So I will really narrow down the scope on the aspects that are important for the victims today, which is the liability rules, the insurance system, and the compensation system. So the laws that have been enacted in the year of 1961, I will just mention them briefly because they will come back later. This is first the Nuclear Damages Act, which is the most important act. Then there is a second act from the same year on the indemnity agreements. This act has basically the purpose to provide for safety, for financial resources that can be used in the event of an accident. Then some rules are governed by the civil code. For instance, the expiry of claims after 20 years and so forth. These are general rules. And then there are very, very specific rules that were enacted after the Fukushima accident, as the general laws, the historical laws proved to be completely insufficient, and they're also very, very ambiguous in many respects, so they had to be specified by special guidelines. And I think we have now at least 8 or even more guidelines, because they kept on amending them after the accident, to stipulate what kind of damage can be compensated for, who is eligible, who victims, evacuees from which zones are eligible for what kind of damage. So does it include psychological harm, does it include reputational damages? These details are set forth in these guidelines. And then finally, it's important to know that Japan was not a signatory of any of the international liability conventions. Most countries in the world are signatories to the conventions either of Vienna, Paris, others, or a combination of these conventions. Japan was not, because at the time, back in the 60s, it was not worried about its neighboring countries. Hence, Japan saw no necessity in joining the international agreements that regulated transboundary accidents. And only in 2015, Japan has joined one of the international conventions. Now let's go back in history to the year when these laws were enacted. Ian has described to you beautifully how the Japanese hunger for electricity has grown, and this is, I think, somewhere in Ginza in Tokyo in 1961, and this is the time when nuclear energy got started in Japan. It's very important to understand the compromise between government interest and corporate interest. Paul has just told us that profitability, of course, is a vital interest of corporations, and then there are also interests by the government, which include stable electricity supply and so forth. The scenario of 1961 in Japan was to get energy independence, and also to get a stable electricity supply, which was affordable. And thirdly, Japan had nuclear ambitions, which of course couldn't be openly voiced at the time. But the mere existence of civil use of nuclear energy in Japan provided a stepping stone for, at any unknown point of time in the future, to perhaps become a nuclear power with military use. So Japan has always stressed its capabilities to reprocess nuclear fission material and so forth. It has the ability, if it wanted to and if it were allowed to start military use of nuclear energy rather quickly. So these are the three vital interests that dominated the discussions at the time, and the result was a compromise. And the compromise was, in liability, a mix of industry's obligations and government obligations. So what we see first looks very straightforward, it looks very nice. We have a liability of the operator for accidents. This liability is exclusive, sekinin shuchu, which means only the operator pays. It's not the supplier, it's not the manufacturer of a power plant, so only the operator pays. And then the liability in theory is unlimited in Japan, this is unique, and it's also strict. Strict liability means that victims do not have to prove in court that there was a fault on behalf of the operating company, because that is completely beyond the things they can understand and prove in court. So this is why we have strict liability. If something happens, basically in any case, no matter whose fault it was, the operator has to pay. The other side of that is that manufacturers and suppliers, which are foreign companies at the time we speak about, which is 1961, are let off the hook, and also the shareholders, because they're protected by the corporate veil of corporate law. Right? So this is something that was introduced by pressure of the supplying companies, which at the time was mainly General Electric from America. And I think it was just mentioned that Japan has been under very strong American influence at that time, so America was able to press this through. And in fact, in all countries in the world, with one example, this is the case. The manufacturer of a nuclear power plant never pays for liability, at least not directly. Then there's this third aspect the industry is obliged to provide financial security. So the operators, they have to set aside a certain amount of money for the event of an accident. However, and this is the second place where the nuclear corporate interest comes into play, is the limitation of this security. I think that the limitation at the time of enactment was in the area of 5 billion yen, and it was slightly increased, but it reached a figure of around 1 billion euro by 2011. I will show you later how insufficient this security was. Now, the other side of the compromise is the government's obligations. First of all, as you know, there's this irony in Japan at the time that the Meiji is both in charge of protecting the persons suffering from nuclear damage, and at the same time, it is responsible for contributing to the sound development of the nuclear industry. So this is a kind of a regulatory, how can we say it, schizophrenic situation. The second aspect is the state aids, which are very important now in the case of Fukushima. So the government, in some cases, is obliged to, in other cases, it can provide state aid to the operators in case the operators don't have enough money to pay for accidents. This certainly is in the interest of the nuclear industry. And the last aspect is the exemption from liability. So there's a special clause in the Japanese law, which also came into play later in the case of Fukushima, that the operators, even the operators, don't have to pay if the damage is caused by a grave natural disaster of exceptional character. In that case, in that scenario, victims can neither turn to the manufacturer nor to the operator, but they simply may hope for the benevolence of the government for payments. So there's no compensation going on if an nuclear accident is caused by a grave natural disaster of exceptional character. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of the burden sharing. This is what I've just explained to you. There are basically three scenarios. The first scenario is is the general accident in which, for which the operator takes out private liability insurance, and this insurance is limited to a very small amount. In theory, anything exceeding that amount has to be paid by the operator. This is here, but the government may pay state aid in order to help the operators pay that money. The second scenario is very similar. It's the scenario of normal earthquakes and so forth. In that case, the government pays the first small chunk. The rest, in theory, has to be paid by the operator, but in fact, we've got the government subsidies. The third scenario is the one that I just mentioned, is the grave natural disaster. In that case, no liability at all, and perhaps the government then can take at its discretion measures to help the victims. Just to make it clear, now it was decided for the case of Fukushima, and that's a complicated topic that I will not talk about today, that Fukushima doesn't constitute an accident that is caused by a grave natural disaster, and it was only caused by a normal earthquake. So this in sentence is a different question, but I'll leave that for now. And I will take you to the consequences of this compromise, which a lot of people call a rotten compromise, of 61, exactly 50 years later. This is, of course, the image of the exploding nuclear power plant. I have to mention this image, so I included it in the presentation for reasons of copyright. But let's go forward and look at the question: who, in fact, is paying today for the victims? It is very well known that TEPCO very soon faced insolvency after the accident because of many reasons: the cost of containing the crisis, management, decontamination, the power plant, and the expenses for fossil fuels to compensate for the nuclear power stations that had to be switched off. Very soon brought the company in a very, very difficult position. Now, in such a situation, also banks usually don't grant loans, so there had to be other possibilities to finance the compensation of the victims. Again, we're talking about over 2 million people who've lost their jobs, who've left their their work behind, who've left their cattle or their fishing boats and everything behind, and it's not only their medical expenses and their suffering, it's also merely their income that has to be compensated for. Now, immediate electricity price hikes are also something that is obviously not a very popular measure for a government to take after such an accident. And direct subsidies to TEPCO would have been also politically difficult in this situation. Now, my things have disappeared. That is not important because I can still explain to you what happened with this very, very simplified chart of the compensation plan the government came up with in the summer of 2011. So this plan has changed and it's undergone amendments. But what's essential to understand from this slide is that it was very, very ambiguously the government both conducted a bailout of TEPCO and, if you want, also a bail-in. So we have the victims here, and the victims need to be compensated. And because the funds of TEPCO were insufficient and the insurance amounts were far too low, the government could have paid the victims directly. That would have been, going up from the treasury directly to the victims. But instead, the government decided to keep TEPCO alive, like a zombie, for many reasons. And therefore, it created this financing corporation, which many of you have, of course, heard about. And the financing corporation then makes capital infusions into TEPCO to enable TEPCO to compensate the victims. But not only this, also financial institutions, creditors, were required to extend loans to TEPCO, and that's why you can call it a bail-in, because it's also the government made use of creditors, and also without prior legal obligation, other nuclear power plant operators have to contribute to this fund. This was absolutely outside of the scope of the law that had been enacted before, but it was a simple necessity to create a solution. The second important consequence of the situation of 1961 is today that we have the insufficient insurance. For some reason, again, my lines disappear, but I'll tell you. So what I try to explain to you is that, of course, it's in the industry's interest to keep costs of nuclear energy low, and also it's in the government's interest to keep costs of energy low and profits high for the industry. Whereas on the other hand, you can say that it is in the public interest. Well, this is certainly also in the public interest, at least the costs. But furthermore, the public interest requires that the premiums for the insurance re-internalize the actual costs of externalized risks. So what we've just seen is a socialization of private risk that cannot be in the public interest. Also, an insurance system would create incentives for safety investments. Because, for instance, imagine you have a very, very modern and safe nuclear power plant. The insurance company you approach will always say, oh yes, we love your power plant. It's so safe, it's so new, it's so modern. Your insurance will be much cheaper than the insurance for the other power plant, which is really old and we don't really trust. So if you have a true liability in an insurance system, you also create incentives to invest in safety. Today, in Japan, if you invest in safety, that doesn't show up on your balance sheet. It's only money you lose. But if actually investments in safety and technology can reduce the insurance premiums, the companies have an incentive to do that. Then, of course, full insurance coverage will, of course, promote public acceptance of nuclear energy. And this is a very complex question which has been debated for decades now, the question whether you can actually insure a nuclear power plant. And experts are divided, but it's certainly true that you can pool the risks of many operators together in one pool, which is what essentially the Americans are doing with the Price-Anderson Act. And in Germany you have a Solidarvereinbarung, which is a little bit of a similar model. So you can pool the risks to increase the assets that are available in the event of an accident. And today there are even offers on the table of reinsurers that offer now nuclear insurance for nuclear reactors up to 10 billion euros. 10 billion euros is still anywhere between perhaps, well, it's a few percent of the scope of Fukushima. 10 billion euros at least would be enough to evacuate people, to conduct immediate medical screenings and so forth. So this is the aspect of insurance. This is the last point of my analysis. I'm not as good as Paul in making fancy graphs, because this is usually not what lawyers do. What I want to convey to you is the disproportionality between the liability, the actual liability of Fukushima being a medium-scale accident, a medium-scale nuclear accident. This graph is also wrong because it's outdated. It says that the amounts paid out to Fukushima victims using state subsidies are 15 billion. This is complete. We're now approaching 50 billion euros. Only not even 5 years after the accident. And you can see, so this is ever increasing, and it will increase for many more years to come. Because in nuclear, it's unlike other accidents, the long tail accidents are what is really expensive and unknown. And set that in contrast to the insurance that nuclear power plant operators have to take out. It varies from country to country, but essentially, in France was long popular for having insurance and liability of only around 90 million euro. Imagine when you want to drive your car, you have to take out a liability coverage. I think that covers up to 10 million euros. You run a nuclear power plant in France, it's almost as easy. Japan is one of the countries that in 2011 had one of the highest amounts, but still it was around 1.2 billion euros, and set that against 80 billion or maybe much more of an accident. It's simply insufficient. Okay, so why do we need a true corporate liability instead of state aids to the corporations? First, actual liability has a deterring effect on operators. If you're not accountable for your actions, you will not care about their results. Then secondly, we have the corporate veil of the shareholders for an inherently dangerous activity. Corporate law shields the shareholders from any responsibility. All they lose is their assets. But before they have received the dividends for years and years. Thirdly, as I explained to you earlier, manufacturers and suppliers are let off the hook. In theory, under Japanese law, the operator that is liable can make a contract with the manufacturer and the supplier. It has a right of recourse. So first the operator compensates the victims, and then it can get the money back from the supplier. But operating companies, they simply can't do that because the bargaining power of the manufacturers, of the big companies, is just too strong. Well, obviously, the state aids for compensation are indirect state aids or even direct state aids for nuclear energy, and therefore they distort the actual price of nuclear energy. Finally, it's also unfair competition because, of course, any source of energy receives direct or indirect subsidies. But these subsidies now for the compensation of Fukushima, which are now in the region of 50 billion euros, they are substantial. They are substantial, and they have to be factored in when you go and tell people nuclear is the cheapest and most viable option we have. Because you have to factor that in and you have to be honest. Okay, I just have a few more minutes, maybe 3 minutes left or so. I have included this picture of The Simpsons, Mr. Burns, famously running a nuclear power plant, because of course we have to be objective, and it's not about telling you the stereotypes about nuclear corporations, but the question is whether there is actually regulatory capture in the nuclear. Now, Paul has done extensive empirical research on that question and has come to the conclusion that at least for the time after 2011, when it comes to the restarts, the question whether certain reactors are restarted or not, he cannot find evidence of nuclear, of a regulatory capture in the Japanese nuclear industry. And that might be true because the Fukushima accident has changed the agenda. We live in a different world now, even in Japan, despite the limited impact on institutional change. But the question I want to ask today is the situation of 1961, which determined the situation of 2011. And what I see there, with all the Genpa Tsumoda, which we'll be hearing more about tomorrow, and yesterday we already heard Professor Waldenberg was talking about the information monopoly, and we all these things like Amakudari and all these things that shape the nuclear industry. In the situation of 1961, when America was dominating Japan and America could push through the corporate interest of GE, which was the supplier of the reactors of Fukushima, to me, regulatory capture, the situation that governments are actually influenced and the regulator is regulating in the interest of the party it should be regulating, I think this holds true for Japanese nuclear law enacted in 1961. So to conclude, I would like to give you a very brief outlook on the impact of Fukushima. Regarding the system of liability and insurance, nothing has changed in Japan. We have a lot of debate about this in the European Union. We had a lot of debate about this in the European Union. The German Commissioner for Energy, after Fukushima, Günther Oettinger, he set out to reform nuclear liability and insurance within the European Union at least, but this process has stalled. So I'm sorry to conclude with this perhaps dark outlook, but I can at least tell you that the problems in nuclear insurance and nuclear liability on a global scale, Japanese scale, they are not solved. Thank you very much.